everybody. Well, I want to wish you a happy St. David's Day, first of all. This is perhaps an appropriate date then to talk about how a guy who grew up in a monoglot environment in Yorkshire ended up lecturing through the medium of Welsh about the history of Russia. And that's basically the story today. Now, there's nothing at all, particularly in this company, unique or special about my language learning background, but it's going to be a bit of a run through, trip down memory lane for me. But then everybody's story, of course, is unique in its own way, and in everybody's personal history, there are elements that we can draw from that might chime with you in terms of how I've done things or how you are doing things. So I'm trying to pull out, as well as remembering some of my own language learning life, pull out some things that might be relevant to you, although you, of course, may take completely different things away from it. So a bit of background, first of all. As I say, I grew up in Yorkshire, and I was thinking about this the other day. Really, when I was a kid, nobody spoke any other language than English. I did not know anybody in our school even who spoke another language. Everything was just in English. And yet, I did have relatives in Wales, distant cousins of my father, who spoke Welsh. And occasionally we went down on holidays and I heard them using the language. I also was taken on holiday to Scandinavia, to France by my parents when I was 6, 7, 10 years old. And so I was aware that other languages were out there. And I always thought it would be a really cool thing, actually, to be able to communicate making sounds in a different language. But like many people at school, I did French, I did German, dropped the German pretty quickly because, of course, I didn't understand any grammar. We weren't taught grammar, so I couldn't understand about the case system. French, I tried hard, but, of course, I was not able to speak, and I dropped that when I was 16, the first opportunity. I think the biggest problem for me with language learning at school was that languages were such an abstract idea. There were no foreign languages really in the culture. There was no obvious reason to learn the language. And then, of course, at school, if you're doing maybe 3 half-hour periods a week or something like that, it's just not long enough to really become fluent in a language. And this links up to what we were talking about the way Irish is taught in schools perhaps today. It's not the way to go about getting kids fluent in a language. But nevertheless, the roots were there, and I got the bug for languages actually in the 6th form, by which stage I was not studying. I dropped French as an A-level, any languages for A-level, but I was having to do a bit of extra work on the side because I was going to university to read history, and I needed to brush up my French because at the end of the first term, there was going to be a big exam which involved studying a historical text in the French language. So I went up to university. I'd started during the summer vacation after A-levels to brush up my French again in anticipation of this. Actually, at the end of the first term, it used to be then, this big exam that I had to do as a history undergraduate. And I was, by this stage, very determined that I wanted to be able to speak French, although for me it still seemed like an impossible task to be able to do that, simply, I think, because of the number of words that you have to learn in a new language. But as I settled into university life, I was already feeling a rather little bit of envy of those students who were doing joint honours, actually, say, in French and history. I wanted to do history, but I also wished I was doing a language as well. And I was also a little envious of those who were coming back, the 19-year-olds who'd taken a year out before they came to university to go travelling or to learn another language, that sort of thing. So I wanted a piece of this. And after the first preliminary exam, then I had a lot of time because there were no more exams until actually the way it used to work then. My university was through till the end of the 3rd year in history. So I'd got time then to keep going with my French. But I also, because I'd got the language bug, I wanted to start another language. And this is how I started to get into Welsh. Now, why Welsh? Well, I've already explained partly because of my family background. I was aware of the language. My grandfather, who died before I was born, my dad's dad, was a first language Welsh speaker, but my dad grew up in Yorkshire, didn't know the language. In those days, my dad was born in the end of the 30s, it was not fashionable, it was not a way to get ahead to teach your kids Welsh. So he didn't know the language. But my parents, had given me this Welsh name, Gareth. So that really affected, I think, my sense of identity. And there were little straws in the wind. This box was one that my dad made when he was at school. It says, Cymru am byth, Welsh forever, in a woodworking lesson. And he had given me this box, and that was one of the things that I always was fascinated by when I was a small kid. So I started learning Welsh, partly to reclaim my family heritage, and partly also because the written form of the language looked so wonderful. All those consonants, impronounceable, actually very easy to pronounce Welsh once you know that W is a consonant and that Y is always a consonant as well. But I was fascinated by the form of the language, the written form of the language. But I remember when I was I was studying in Oxford at Blackwell's bookshop, the big language section, not nearly as good today as it used to be, but I was looking at all the language textbooks and I was thinking, do I really want to start Welsh? Because everybody speaks English. What's the point of this? And I think that would be my first sort of general observation, that when you're starting a language, it's important to choose a language which chimes, I hate this phrase, resonates, but it chimes with you, it speaks to you in some way. So much about motivation is, knowing why you're undertaking the project. And it's been my experience, at least, that things have gone best when I'm doing things that I've chosen to do because they speak deeply to me. And that can then open up opportunities for you, as I will show, which you could never have imagined at the beginning. So I connected with Welsh and I found myself learning it. Now, some language friends of mine a couple of years ago were encouraging me to try and sharpen up my act as a language learning enthusiast and blogger. And they said, you need to formulate and package your method, you see. Now, I'm a bit skeptical about this sort of thing, about quick answers, but it did get me thinking back to what's worked best for me as a language learner. And that's the way I still really work today, for better or for worse, because of or despite my approach. I've managed to get quite a good working knowledge in several languages. And what I did with Welsh then, for the second time now, having got my French up to speed, was basically what I still do today. So I like to take a core textbook. This is the one I had for Welsh, Teach Yourself one, Teach Yourself Living Welsh by T.J. Rhys-Jones, and I would work through the core textbook and basically flashcard the entire thing. So, and also patterns, not just individual words, but also chunks of language, so that I got a map of the language in my head and the basic language vocabulary, grammar patterns, and then using a spaced recall system to, because I've got a bad memory, which is one of the great blessings that I have as a language learner, because I understand that I'm just not going to remember it, therefore I have to get a system of spaced recall up and running. And often I do, there's been a lot of emphasis on speaking from day one, that sort of thing. I'm a bit more swinging back to the silent period theory now, even for second language acquisition. And I spent a lot of time, as with French, listening to my languages. Then this was pre-internet, so with the French I was trying to find it on the medium wave radio. In the evening, the physicists may be able to explain why. Somehow the reception seemed to be better, but there was no Welsh. You couldn't pick up any Welsh. It was only later that I then get into the field, and this is my approach again now. I'm trying to learn Japanese at the moment, trying to get a map in my head of the language before I start really trying to speak. Now, in the pre-internet era, getting to hear the language was a lot more difficult than it is now. So Welsh you could not pick up on the radio in England. I was sitting in Oxford, Radio Cymru, which had started, this was about 1986, in 1979, had what was broadcast on what used to be called VHF. Then for some reason they started calling it FM. But it doesn't travel as far, and you certainly couldn't pick it up even in the west of southern England. So I couldn't hear the language, and I was working through this book. This book, unlike the later edition by Rhys Jones, he wrote 3 for Teach Yourself. The later one had a cassette with it, the height of modernity. This one didn't have any audio at all, and so I didn't really hear the language until I went to Wales as a Welsh learner for the first time. There was a University Welsh Club. I didn't go to that because that was for native speakers or people who could already speak the language. I could have pushed myself forward, but as a bit of a shy introvert, I wasn't about to do that either, and I wanted to get this map of the language in my head. But then I went for a summer school in Bangor to really practice the language for the first time. And again, even then, finding out about those sort of things was much more difficult than it is today. So you had to always send off the famous stamped, self-addressed envelope, and then you would get some details coming back about the course. You could then excitedly open up and find out all about it, and then apply and go off for 3 weeks to learn some basic Welsh. And that's what I did, and that was an amazing summer school experience. And then I paused the language for 2 years while I concentrated on my history studies. And then after I'd graduated from university, I decided to go back to Wales and to take what used to be called a year out, is now called a gap year, to get really good at the language. So I took this year off in Wales, starting with the 6-week course at Lampeter University, which was run by an amazing guy called Chris Rees, who'd learnt his own Welsh. Another theme, the contribution that learners can make to minority languages in the war, really. And he had then set up this so-called Ulpan course based on the methods which had been used in Israel to revive the Hebrew language. It was an intensive 6 weeks, and I came out of that then, I was listening to the radio now, which I could receive every evening, doing a lot of flashcarding. I was in classes full-time with the group for 6 weeks, able to communicate basically at a basic level in the language. And I decided after Lampeter, I was marooned there for 6 weeks because I had no car, to go and spend the year, it's actually about 9 months, in Aberystwyth, in the centre of the coast, the Cardigan Bay, sort of midway between North and South Wales. I chose to go there, and I think it's important if you're going off to learn a language to really think carefully about the geography of where you're going to be, particularly if it's a minority or lesser used language. And I chose Aberystwyth. Really, it was a trade-off between being somewhere Welsh, as Welsh-speaking as possible, and actually being in a place where I'd have a chance to find some work, where there were going to be things going on, and also that I could get to by train quite easily too. Well, not quite easily, but at least I had the option to get there by train. So I was in Aberystwyth for a year. Now there, it's about 50% Welsh-speaking. That is not high enough for the language to be the lingua franca on the street. However, there was a lot of Welsh around, but even there, you really needed to get plugged into networks to successfully get sort of an immersive experience in the language. Of course, that's true for us. Even if you retire to Spain, you can live there then for 30 years, not pick up the language. So integrating yourself early into networks where you're going to be actually expected to use the language, what are the norms of how the language is used, getting plugged into that is really important. I wasn't lucky with work. I had a job as an administrative assistant at the Forestry Commission Wales, which is the lowest rung, or it was then, on the civil service ladder, paying £2.45 an hour. And the office was all in English. And there I did encounter some dismissive attitudes from some fellow English colleagues. It was while I was wasting my time on this project of learning Welsh, but some quiet encouragement from some of the cowed, perhaps, Welsh natives who also worked in the Forestry Commission office. So it was a mixed experience. I also threw myself into attending, I'm an Anglican, I would go to Anglican church on a Sunday evening, and I attended chapel, the Presbyterian chapel, with my host family on a Sunday morning. And that was a great way to get very, very high quality literary Welsh, the hymns and so on, and the sermons. I was much more religious in a conventional sense than I am now. So now it would feel perhaps for me rather hypocritical to do that, but it didn't then. But you need to find some way to get exposure in a minority situation, it seems to me, to the language. I wasn't so lucky with work. I was very lucky with the accommodation because I was lodging with a local Welsh-speaking family, and they were highly educated, very literate in the language as well, and it was great to live with them. So that bit actually worked, and I got fluent in those 9 months. Although I didn't have that much fun. I wasn't particularly happy in that year because I was stuck in this English-speaking environment for work, and I didn't really take off socially. I'm not, and I certainly wasn't then, the sort of person who can just saunter into a pub and sort of be friends with half the pub by the end of the evening. And I was going to avoid the other learners like the plague. There was an association called Cymdeithas y Dysgwyr. It was a sort of learners' club. There was no way I wanted to hang out with other Welsh learners. I wanted the real thing with the natives. Now, that's not something I would do again. I think you can get an awful lot from other learners now, but I was quite purist and quite extreme in my views then. I would prefer to sit at home and watch Welsh television than to go out and hang out with a load of other sort of the blind leading the blind, as I saw it then. That was my view. But anyway, I got fluent, losing those methods, having chosen the right place to go, some luck at getting plugged into networks. And I want to say just a bit about then the minoritised language situation of Welsh. And I like the term minoritised rather than minority language because to me it symbolises the fact that it's not an accident that languages are pushed to the margin very often. This is the result of deliberate political decisions. Language is political, as we've heard already this morning, over the centuries. It's the result of a historical power play. And when you hear, monoglots here in the Isles today talking about the decline of the other languages here, you would often think they were talking about forces of nature, languages being predestined to die out because modernity it means monolingualism in English, and it's the forces of Darwinian struggle, that sort of thing almost. Whatever. English is the lingua franca in Aberystwyth then, and now, and in really probably all parts of Wales. And that came with it, with that came a lot of complex attitudes. And this is one of the interesting but also frustrating aspects, I think, of learning a minoritised language. So the English speakers I encountered then came on a spectrum from sort of amused indulgence at those who insisted on keeping Welsh going, sort of pat on the head approach. Of course, there were some also enthusiastic converts. I'm talking about people who were not from Wales now. Suspicion to outright hostility. So that was a bit confusing. And then among the non-Welsh-speaking Welsh, there were also a range of attitudes from, I wish I spoke Welsh, to a sort of chippy defensiveness, to again a sort of outright hostility. So sort of mixed up with sense of this language is maybe like my grandfather's generation, not something you want to pass on, sort of Stockholm syndrome, or a realistic appraisal of the situation, depending on your perspective. But this is something of an emotional roller coaster that you have to deal with when you're learning, it seems to me, a minoritized language, that you don't if you just go to Germany to learn German or France to learn French. It's what makes it interesting, but it can make it quite frustrating as well. Interesting things I observed. Obviously in Welsh, there's a sort of diglossia between the high standard written historical literary language, which I'll come back to, and conversational language. So that's one interesting issue. It's exaggerated often, but nevertheless, there's a bigger difference, I'd say, between written Welsh and colloquial Welsh than there is in English. Although, again, that is, I think, often exaggerated. And then also code switching from English to Welsh, from different registers of Welsh. But two interesting examples of that. So one time with my host family, the lady of the house was on the phone to the plumber who was going to do some work. And I was sitting in the room next door listening to her. The phone was fixed on the wall. She was talking to him, and they were going in and out of Welsh and English, and I couldn't understand what was going on, why this was. And I asked her afterwards, and she explained that every time they started to talk about the business, when he was going to come, what work he was going to do, especially how much it would cost, he went into English. But when they were catching up about life in general, the family, the weather, he was happy to talk in Welsh. So you have this idea of the language is limited to certain domains. That was one interesting experience. Another one, I was going with my host, who's a professor of history, and he was going to Coleg Harlech, which was one of the adult education colleges in Wales, in Harlech. And he stopped on the way to find the way. We could see the castle there. We'd driven up. I was going to just sit in on the lecture at the back because it was going to be interesting. And he wound down the window. There was a lady, maybe about 60, walking up the hill. He wound down the window and he asked her where Coleg Harlech was. And it must have been the way he pronounced the place name, because he asked her in English, as you would with somebody you don't know in Wales, and she began to answer him, and mid-sentence, she switched from English to Welsh with no indication, without batting an eyelid. And I thought that was very, very interesting as well, because there was no way she didn't know him, apart from the general air and the way he'd asked the question, perhaps that she could have known whether he was a Welsh native speaker or not. So that I thought was quite interesting. So I came back. Anyway, at the end of those 9 months, I then had a summer off, so I went to Grenoble actually to do a 3-week course to keep my French going. Obviously, the way one would do if you've spent a year learning a language, then obviously the ideal break would be to go and do a bit more language work somewhere else. So I did that. And then I went back to Oxford as a graduate student. Now, during the time in Wales, because I'd got a place to do a DPhil in Russian history, and so I'd had to start learning Russian on the side. And I'd met somebody on my Welsh course who was a retired guy in his early 70s who had a very interesting background history, but had also written the first ever English Comey dictionary and had done his doctorate on the Comey literature. That's a Finnic language which is spoken around the Perm area in the Urals in Russia. And I went to see him several times with my Oxford, my Penguin book of Russian, Learn Russian Penguin book. There were some cassettes with that as well, and he helped me. So then I was in full swing trying to get my Russian up to speed, because I had to read my documents in Russian to be able to get on with my research. So obviously a way to advance that was going to be to start learning German as well, obviously. Makes sense. So I found myself doing that. But this time back at the university, I was in the Welsh Society. There was an old Welsh society in the university, and I was using the language all the time. My friends back in Aberystwyth were sending me cassettes now. I was asking them to record the news broadcasts for me so that I could keep hearing broadcast and radio programs in the language as well. And that summer, at the end of my first year back as a grad student, I volunteered at the Urdd camp in Llangranog. The Urdd is a Welsh youth movement, and I was helping out there with the kids at this sort of adventure camp, if you like. So what can we say from that? I kept the active engagement with the language going. Even though the project had sort of finished, kept up the engagement, and I was really choosing languages, taking a positive choice in terms of the thesis topic I'd chosen, because I could just have easily have done, I'm a 19th century historian, a thesis in English history with as much interest. But I wanted to do Russian history partly because I knew that would get me a chance to travel, to learn other languages, and to go abroad during the doctoral period. And that is then what I did for the next 4 or 5 years. I was out and about. I went to Freiburg in Breisgau, first of all, in Germany, on the Erasmus program. I don't know whether people are going to be able to do that anymore, which makes me very, very annoyed. There I found Welsh speakers. There were some Germans there who were learning Welsh. There were also a couple of natives who just happened to live in the town. So we used to meet. And then I went off to Russia. I went to Leningrad for a year. Went over there, 8 days after the coup had failed. Gorbachev was clinging to power, and it was a very, very interesting time to be in the country as it was transforming very rapidly. During that time, I developed a bit of a sideline as a pundit on BBC Radio Cymru, talking about Russian politics and what was going on in Russia. The Welsh radio, they always manage to dig a Welsh speaker out. Wherever they are, there's an earthquake, volcano, revolution. They always seem to manage to find a Welsh speaker. I was that Welsh speaker, and it was great fun to do that over the crackling phone lines. They had to phone me because when I first arrived, you couldn't just telephone out of Russia. So you had to go to the post office and order the call the day before, say how long you wanted to speak for, what the number was going to be, so that they would then come back, you would come back at the allotted time, they would then be able to monitor what you were saying, obviously to record it, and you then got your 2 minutes. And if your mum hadn't finished jabbering by then, and you hadn't got all your requests across, they would still cut the phone off anyway. So that was quite a thing, but it was an amazing time, and much of which I spent in the archives working away. I think, again, if I had the time again, I would have ditched the thesis, got a decent camera and a tape recorder, and just gone onto the streets and done a lot more photography, vox pops, and so on. I did some of that, but it was such a fascinating time to be there. Anyway, I then went on for a year in Helsinki. I was writing up my thesis. And then I moved back to Germany, to Heidelberg. At this stage, one of my professors had got the chair there, and I worked for him as a research assistant. I worked as a waiter. I was getting my German up to speed. But I was also keeping going with the Welsh. So by this time, I was subscribing to Golwg, which is a Welsh magazine. And I also found a Welsh speaker. It turned out that Professor Yorkshireman I, who was the professor of Japanese at Heidelberg, was a Welsh fanatic. So he took me out for pizza several times as a penniless grad student, just for the opportunity to speak Welsh with me, and we talked about Welsh novels and so on, and that was all great. So never underestimate the doors that a minoritised language might open. And then one day when I was in the history faculty office, because I worked there as a sort of research assistant, the phone went, and it was actually for me. It was BBC Wales again, and they said, would you mind if we took you over to Latvia, all expenses paid, to help us with the making of Taro Now, which was a bit like the Panorama programme, about the situation in the Baltic states, which had just become independent. The Russian forces were still there. And I thought about it for about 3 seconds, and then I agreed to this project. So I went over and had a marvellous week there, as working as a translator from Russian into Welsh. And I was interviewed myself. That photo is me. This is the only actual historic photo, all the rest are recent ones with a slightly different hairstyle, in 1994 on a hotel balcony in Riga. Being interviewed by Dylan Yorkshireman, who's now a chaired bard of the National Eisteddfod, is a leading Welsh journalist. And the cameraman there is Guito. Now, this was the latest technology. This camera was very notable because it was so portable. You might not realize that from looking at it. But we went around factories, we went to the National Bank, we interviewed the foreign minister, we went to a collective farm, we interviewed the leader of the Northwestern Group of Forces of the Russian army. The Russians were still there. That was an interesting interview. We went in to see this general. And at the end, he turned to me. I was doing all the Russian-Welsh interpreting, and he said, it's really sorry I can't speak English. So he was completely oblivious to the fact. He thought BBC, you see. He thought it was all happening in English. But Guito had actually mortgaged his house a second time. He was a freelance cameraman to buy that camera. That camera cost £20,000, which was, you could buy a nice terrace house in Wales for £20,000 at that time. So that always stuck in my memory. So basically my Welsh, this thing which everybody speaks English anyway, there's no point learning it, it actually opened a lot of doors. And it continued to do that for me in subsequent years. So I ended up getting a job in Aberystwyth to lecture in Russian history. I was just finishing my thesis, and just at the right time, I ended up landing this job. Now, the way that happened was, first of all, because I was subscribing to this magazine, Golwg, I'd seen an advert for a job working on a history of Welsh, the architecture of Welsh chapels. Now, the thing with this post was that it was all through the medium of Welsh. It was going to be at the Centre for Advanced Celtic Studies, which is next door to the National Library of Wales, which is that building there in Aberystwyth. I applied for that job. I was interviewed for it, and I didn't get it. The interview went quite well, but it wasn't my specialist area. There's no reason why I should have thought I might get it. And that was that. However, then a few months later, I was actually invited to apply for a lectureship. What actually was a much better job, was a permanent job, paid more, and where I'd be able to use my own specialist area, Russian history. So, you know, sometimes when you apply for things and you're not successful, you never know how this might, you've got on the radar, put it that way, and you can always learn things. So if you're uncertain whether you should apply for a job, often it makes sense just to go for it anyway. I think another reason I got that job was because I offered an unusual combination of skills. So the other two candidates on the shortlist were both Welsh historians. They were both from Wales. I was a bit different, but I was also offering to teach European history, particularly Russian history, through the medium of Welsh. And I think it's a good thing if you want to use languages in your career, if you can combine the languages with some other specialist skill. This can often lead to opportunities that might not otherwise have been there. Don't just think in terms of working as a language teacher or a translator or as an interpreter. Wonderful things though these are, some of which I've done, others I would love to do, but nevertheless, don't forget you can always combine other things as well to get a job using your languages. So I was back in Aberystwyth with, on a completely different level with loads of Welsh-speaking colleagues and friends, and this again changed the perspective on what had been going on 7 years earlier when I had what did not feel like a particularly successful or happy time in Aberystwyth. Here that was all now paying off. It's always too early to draw the final balance sheet, I think, when you're doing projects in life, to know, you never know how things are going. If you keep engaged, pay off later on down the line. So my job was to teach Russian history through the medium of Welsh. This is just a quick background slide, just reminding you that Welsh has a very strong literary culture. The Bible was translated into Welsh in 1588. That was the complete Bible. There'd been earlier translations of the New Testament. So there was also a medieval poetry tradition. There'd been formed what one linguist described as a spontaneous literary koine of the language in the Middle Ages, which you can contrast, for example, with the history of Breton. And by the end of the 18th century, thanks in part to the circulating schools, which Tony mentioned earlier on, the Welsh had the highest level of popular literacy in Welsh in the world. So this was a language with a striking background. And there was an industrial Welsh-speaking culture. So the Chartist movement in Newport, for example, at the beginning of the 19th century, in Merthyr Tydfil, which was industrial, was the largest centre in Wales, again into the beginning of the 19th century. There was a Welsh-speaking urban culture, things like newspapers developing, radical movement, and so on. The language then shifts in the second half of the 19th century, particularly as a lot of migrants come in from Ireland and England because of the strength of the Industrial Revolution. That was important background. In the universities, less so. Owen Glyndor's rebellion in at the beginning of the 15th century, one of the items on his programme was to have two universities in Wales. One would have been in the north, one would have been in the south. Now, that didn't all work out very well, but if it had, obviously the language of instruction would have been Latin, but the history might have been rather different. But Welsh speakers helped finance the founding of the first university college in Wales in Aberystwyth, even though, and there was a Welsh professor appointed, professor of Welsh language and literature quite early in the 1870s, but most of the tuition was through English. And that situation continued through to the 1960s when the sort of language rights movement started to kick off. And this is the first language rights demonstration, Pont Trefychan in Aberystwyth in 1963, when the newly formed Welsh Language Society blocked the traffic. This was caused sensation. This is the protest in action in Wales, that these respectable nonconformists should do such a thing. But that was the start of a vigorous campaign to put the language a bit more central in Welsh life. So what I found at the university in the mid-1990s was quite a lot of tokenism, a tradition that the principal needed to be a Welsh speaker, for example, a lot of visual bilingualism, but not much use of the language where it actually mattered, in the lecture theatre and in the internal administration of the language in the university. I was a Welsh-medium appointment. There were only a handful of us, but because there were no proper structures there, by the time that I left, I stayed there for 5 years, till 2000, I was coming under pressure to teach through the medium of English as well, which of course I was happy to do, but it was phrased as, we want your expertise to be available to the English language students as well, quite a nice flattering way of putting it. But the lecturers who were lecturing on Germany or France, who were English speakers, didn't need to learn Welsh to teach through the medium of Welsh. So it was always a one-way thing. And also the research, the way that research was assessed at that time, again, it prioritized publications, international publications, particularly if you had an international reputation, which basically means they know about you in the United States. That's what international means. So if you wanted to start publishing in Welsh in the small Welsh journals, there was sort of structural disadvantages, and certainly no challenges to the norm that English is the dominant language in the university. And we did try and sort of challenge that. And so a couple of vignettes. One day I went upstairs into another department, actually the English department, probably the wrong one to choose. I was trying to find a photocopier, and I walked into the office there, and I said, oes na llun copier yma rywle? Is there a photocopier anywhere, somewhere? And I realized then I didn't know the people in that room, so I tried to start, contrary to the norm, to speak in Welsh to people I didn't know. I realized they didn't. Then I said it in English and said, oh, yes, just round the corner. You'll need your card to use it. Then one of my friends, a few days later, who was a lecturer in the English department, I met her in a pub or something, and she said, oh, I heard you came into the office the other day demanding to speak Welsh, you see. So, in other words, you challenge norms, then that will be interpreted as an aggressive behavior. Yeah. Another group of us got together and tried to persuade the university to use more Welsh in its internal administration. It's a major employer in the area. A lot of the staff were local, and I really think starting to use the language in an administrative context in the workplace is very important. So we were collecting signatures to try and prevail on the principal, who was a Welsh poet, professor of Welsh previously, to change the policy. Of course, nothing happened. It ran into the sand. So trying to challenge the structures and the norms of language use is very, very difficult. And you can find yourself, perhaps, when you're doing a minoritized language, are you going to be challenged? Are you going to accept the situation as you find it? Are you going to take it as you find it? Or if you're trying to innovate in language use, then are you going to end up being a language activist, in fact? Because, as I say, you are provoking these responses, as is always the case, of course, when any form of oppression is challenged. Now, this is just a quick slide. This is the wonderful Arts Centre, the Students' Union in Aberystwyth in the background. But I did observe that Welsh student life was a sort of parallel life. So the Welsh students, in a way, had the Welsh-speaking students, the best of both worlds, because they were fully integrated so far as they wanted to be into the huge mass of, we're talking maybe 4,000 or 5,000 students, maybe about 500 of them are Welsh-speaking. There's a question there about the size of the institution relative to the needs of the country and so on, but that's a separate topic. But there was a Welsh-speaking hall of residence. That as well had been controversial. You're ghettoising, excluding other people because you want to conduct your life through your own language in your own country. There was a Welsh-speaking union, Students' Union, which was a subgroup of the main NUS-affiliated student union. There's a Geltaidd, which is a very old, set up in the 1870s, sports society in the university, Welsh-speaking. There was an intercollegiate Eisteddfod. All the different colleges of what was still the Federal University of Wales would compete in the Eisteddfod. So the whole mental world, which is a cultural festival annually, sort of poetry and singing and so on, the whole cultural world was a different subjective experience, I think, for those Welsh-speaking students who wanted to take part in that and be part of that. And of course, not all did, but a great many did. So my job anyway was to teach these students some Russian and Soviet history. So I had a blank slate, really. I was able to do more or less what I wanted, develop my own modules, and there was not much to go on in terms of textbooks or materials to read through the medium of Welsh. Several classics had been, some of Lermontov's tales, some Tolstoy had been translated into Welsh, but these were literary works. There was no Russian department left at the university. That had been culled in the 1980s, as had several of the Russian departments in Wales. No specialist literature to speak of, but my ambitions around my role were very much coloured by my view of seeing Welsh as a full-service European mainstream language, which is how I saw and see it. I was coloured by my experience of having used Russian and German and been in Russian and German universities, in Finland as well, in Helsinki. I spent a year there, seeing how other languages than English are actually used in higher education. And I was looking, and I still look to languages like Estonian or Icelandic, where you have dominant languages with far fewer speakers. And we were in Iceland a couple of years ago. They have 5 or 6 higher education institutions, Icelandic medium, massive publishing, but somehow, although there are 2.5 times more Welsh speakers, that's not enough to sustain this sort of provision, and people should be grateful for the crumbs that they have. That wasn't my ambition. But you do face some issues. Technical vocabulary. If you suddenly get a job in taking your language into a new area, do you use English? Do you develop your own technical phrases? What about place and personal names? Do you use the Russian ones? Do you use the English ones? Do you try and Welshify them? With Russian, how do you transliterate? Do you use a W instead of a U? Do you say Sankt Peterburg or St. Petersburg? Yeah. So how do you do it? So I was thinking about these things, wanting to, again, go directly from the Welsh world to the Russian world, not intermediated by English. So these were sort of questions which were on my mind. When you're mediating cultures then, or taking a language into new technical areas, you're having to think about things and do things which in a majority language, where the decisions have already been taken for you. Although that might have been also by just some individual sitting in a library in the 18th century making up words in Russian and in German to use straight from the Latin. So don't believe that other languages, naturally had all the phrases and all the technical vocabulary. So that was then. Now, that's of course a while ago now. I left Aberystwyth in 2000. And there have been quite a few changes since then. So the idea of a separate Welsh college had been around for quite a long time, again, since at least the 1960s. The argument was that would be ghettoizing the language, although we heard yesterday about Fishman's ideas of how important having monolingual environments for a language to give something for learners, that not everything should be translated and made available to speakers of the majority language. There was an argument around that. When I was there was a campaign for a semi-integration model where there'd be separate funding streams, a central registry, to organise a federal Welsh medium college which would have lecturers in each of the different higher education institutions in Wales. And that's what eventually happened 11 years later after I left, when the Welsh government set up the Coleg Cymraeg Cenedlaethol, which is a national college which has a registrar, has administrative headquarters in Carnarvon, and plans and has appointed 110 Welsh medium lecturers in the different institutions to push the boundaries, to teach things like medicine, not just the humanities, and history, important though they are, medicine, dentistry, social care, physics, engineering, and so on in the medium of Welsh. So there's more of that than there ever has been. Still a drop in the ocean compared with what the Welsh sort of proto-state spends on promoting and teaching through English, but nevertheless real progress. And there are scholarships. There's an online scholarly magazine now called Gwerddon, which lecturers can write for and get accreditation for in their research profile. There's something called the Porth, which means the gate, which is where resources can be shared by lecturers and teachers online. And they're also pushing into vocational education as well, which is as important, if not more important in many ways, that people are trained to be mechanics and hairdressers and so on, and more applicable roles in sort of a practical sense shouldn't just all be this highfalutin and rather abstract sort of learning, but really practical learning. So they're pushing into that sort of what we always call further education as well. Finally then, to finish up, so things are moving. A lot of what I found is still the case, but things are nevertheless getting better, I think, with the language in Wales. Since then, I found that the links that I've kept 20 years on with people in Aberystwyth are those I made through the Welsh language. And I think that was because there was a shared interest, a shared passion, and a deeper connection. And though it took me longer to get to know some of my Welsh-speaking colleagues and make friends there, those are really the contacts that have endured. I've kept getting opportunities to use Welsh sort of on the media. I tend to hide away from doing that now because I don't follow events in Russia as closely as I used to do. But there have still been opportunities, very interesting things to do. And then for one period, actually, I went back to Swansea for 9 months when I went on to be a lawyer. I was in Moscow for 5 years, and then in 2009 I came back and I took a year out, and I went to run the Welsh language bookshop in Swansea. And that was good fun just for 9 months when I was deciding what to do next. So again, the language came back. At that time, I was also, I trained to teach Welsh to adults, which is something I've kept going on the side. I've done Welsh house shares. When I was training as a lawyer subsequently, I shared back in Oxford with a friend who's a Welsh speaker, and I've, in my own place now in London, had Welsh tenants as well in my place. So I've been able to keep the language going. Of course, today the internet is so different, and using the language, interacting on social media all the time with it and receiving it through the internet. So that's been my experience, that's it. But the takeaways you can see there, use effective methods, put in the time with your language, make a conscious choice for languages in your life, get yourself into harm's way. Don't expect it just to happen by accident, whether that's about integrating into networks, where you're going to go, how you're spending your time. Combine your languages with other skills if you're hoping to open new doors and get unexpected career opportunities. Take the long-term view. It's always too early to draw the final balance on what you're doing because your perspectives will shift over time if you keep engaged. Be aware of the extra challenges and frustrations that learning a minoritized language involves, and also the extra thrills and rewards, of course, because it's all hands on deck. Understand the power of institutional and social norms, which will enrich but also enrage your experiences as the learner of a minoritized language. Be ambitious for that language. Compare widely different models as to what could be possible, and never underestimate the contribution that learners can make to particularly minority language communities where everybody can, everybody is needed. And Wales is full of, there are loads of learners who've made huge contributions to modern Welsh culture and life. That's it. Thank you very much.